I think everybody's always looking for that silver bullet in terms of solving the housing crisis, and co-living can be a bit of a marmite subject, and some people just don't get it and won't ever get it. But I think what co-living does, it just offers greater choice. Hi, I'm Paul Wellman. I'm Associate Director in the Savills Residential Research Team.
I'm James Hanmer. I'm the Head of Student and Co-living at Savills.
From Ackroyd Lowry, I'm Oliver Lowry.
And I'm John Ackroyd.
And this is Urban Forecast, the show where we talk to the people defining the future of our cities. We discuss their background, what drives them, and the insights they've learned along the way.
This is a podcast for anyone who's interested in how we live, work or play in the cities of the future, and what that means for the built environment today.
So thank you guys for coming in. A very exciting topic today. I'm going to start with you, Paul. Would you like to give a little bit of your background, how you ended up being in this research department specialising in co-living, and then lead on to what you think the size of the market is, the co-living sector?
Sure. So I have been at Savills in the research team for 4.5, 5 years now. Previously, I was at Estates Gazette, EG, the trade magazine. How have I got into co-living? Well, I guess, so at the research team is 35 people strong at Savills. So it's a very big team. We cover all sorts of residential typologies, tenures, etc. Why co-living? I guess it's a really growing sector. So there's real opportunity for growth. And I guess it keeps me young.
And so how did you end up calculating? I've seen a figure bandied around, which perhaps you can talk about, of how many people you think in the UK will be viable fits for co-living. Do you want to talk about how that research evolved and how you ended up with that number and who those people are?
Sure. So we use Experian data, which does lots of demographic data, and it's down to household level, which is really, really key, so we can get a real kind of nuanced picture. Within Experian data, they have information on tenure, age of people within that house, whether they have children, their incomes, and also kind of like their demographics. So using that data, we can then kind of narrow down to try and estimate what we call a kind of like a core target market for co-living. If you take only people that live in the rental sector, are aged between 18 to 40, who don't have children, you get to 1.9 million adults across the UK. Looking at their incomes, we estimate that around sort of 750,000 of those can afford to rent one bed within their local authority. So that's what we're kind of describing as a core target market for co-living.
Okay, so 750,000 approximately.
Yeah.
And that's the number that you consider to be potential people that would want to live. Is that, are all these people, are they living alone currently, or are they in house shares? Do you think that's going to be people moving from house shares into this?
A bit of both, but yeah, lots of people in house shares. So young graduates, but not just young graduates. I think looking at the schemes that have come on stream over the last couple of years, the age is actually quite varied. It's not just young graduates, it's probably that 18 to 40 is your kind of core, but you do get people older than that, which does surprise some people. But yeah, I think we've only got probably 3,500 co-living beds operational at the moment, so it's still a very, very nascent sector, but growing quickly. And the wider kind of student market is probably at that 700,000-800,000 across the country. It's a much more mature sector, but people are getting more used to that sort of living. So the argument is that they would look to live in a co-living type product early on in their kind of young professional career.
Fantastic point to bring in, James. Thank you very much. Great segue on. James, if you wouldn't mind giving a little bit about your background, and then if you could talk a little bit about the sort of pipeline of projects that you're seeing come forward to fill this demand gap, basically. So you've got 700,000 people that could potentially live there, and 3,000 beds currently available. People must be flocking in to be building this stuff.
Yeah, so how I got into it, so I've been over 11 years at Savills. The day job has largely been student accommodation up until this point. A couple of years ago, we were getting a huge amount of inbounds from clients who essentially wanted a contact point for co-living. The product type at that point, and still now actually in the UK, is very much more aligned to student accommodation than it is probably BTR. So I stuck my hand up for that, and actually it's been a really a really enjoyable ride thus far. I think the slight disappointment we've all had is that there hasn't been enough product or as much product as we thought coming through, sort of off the design board through planning successfully. And I think a lot of that is because of the challenges that have been in London around the GLA and late stage review and so on, if you're going down the sui generis planning use.
A good point to bring in planning, in fact. So are you seeing most of the co-living schemes coming forward in this sort of generation 2, I suppose? You've got the original kind of Old Oaks, etc., which were kind of cobbled together, I think, with that was a student resi consent that was kind of, I think, adopted or kind of bastardized. The GLA have now set out their guidance. And are you seeing most of the new co-living schemes come forward as a sui generis?
We are, certainly. And I think that ultimately that's where we're going to see most liquidity on exit. There'll be a larger investor pool for people wanting sui generis consents. The problem is the challenges around getting it out of the ground, due to your late stage review. So a number of schemes that we thought would now be almost actually sort of built and finished, been a bit stuck because they can't actually put a spade in the ground because of uncertainties over that.
And is that because the affordability is it's being done with a financial sort of offset, and then that offset is changing?
Yeah, it's more to do with the late stage review. There's a revaluation at some point post PC, and there's a potential unquantifiable further amount of money that is due to be paid over to the borough, and that's where it becomes problematic. So the use class is the consent, is the preference rather, but we're just not seeing a huge amount of them come through. C1 use consent gives you that immediacy, but again, it's not a straightforward route, and the amount of people that ultimately be there on sale, on divestment, is a bit unknown. There will be people there, but it won't be as deep a pool as we expect for sui generis.
And why do you think that is? Because of the complications with VAT and...
Yeah, there's a little bit of that. I think valuation uncertainty is probably a big part of that.
But surely, C1's a more known entity in that the hotel market has an established way of valuing an asset. Would you not think that it's kind of easier in that respect to give it a value?
I think sometimes it can be, but let's not forget that C1 applies mostly to hotels. So co-living is not a hotel, albeit can share the same use consent. The best scenario is where you have a formal variation of planning consent to allow some long stay of that C1, but the valuers in the space are still getting comfortable in exactly what that yield is. Most valuers are putting a yield that is at or very close to a sui generis value yield for that proportion, and then valuing the shorter let or constrained within 90 days, usual C1 consent at a hotel yield. So it's just there's a bit of a nuance applied to actually how you value it.
Thank you very much. And I think probably a combined answer, what are we seeing the most consistent product is? The Collective, I think, had room sizes of kind of 14 to...
Or less.
Yeah.
So, and you're the expert here, obviously, but most of the stuff that we see coming off the drawing board is between that 20 and 25 square metre rooms. Yeah. So you're in student parlance, all studio schemes, all of that kind of quantum that give people that ensuite bedroom, ensuite bathroom, plus small kitchen area. That model is different to other places in the world. So, for example, the US model seems to be more cluster flat focused, again, as we term it from the student perspective. Yet to see that come in, but I suspect that we will do, which will again really assist and aid in affordability for people.
I think the other thing about doing it that way is, one, you get away from, I think the co-living schemes that I've been around, even the best ones, do feel quite reminiscent of a student scheme. And I think that those cluster flats, I think you described it on another podcast as being like the Friends episode where you've got 4 bedrooms off one kind of shared space. I think that gives it breaks the building down. And also, is there not then the potential that you could just deliver it all under C3 because it's just a residential flat next to another flat next to another flat, which it becomes a sort of build to rent scheme? I'm surprised people aren't doing that more.
Yeah, I would agree. I think rightly or wrongly, people are embarking down a single route at the moment in terms of sort of that ability to offer that kind of cluster bedroom flat configuration as C3. I'd have to sort of speak to or rely on the planners just to understand sort of how that fits in with space standards and so on. But there definitely is room in the market for different types of co-living rather than just a normal studio focus.
So how have you found the kind of take-up, Paul, recently of sort of these generation 2 schemes in terms of how easily they let?
Like I said, I think there is a clear kind of difference between first generation, which we saw a few years ago, and now kind of like, this second generation of schemes. As James said, they are kind of slightly bigger, sort of that sort of 20 to 25 square meters, as residents have demanded those slightly bigger spaces, but still getting all of that add-on amenity space. We had about 2,000 beds complete last year and a few schemes in London. So it is still early days, but we are kind of getting that kind of anecdotal evidence and seeing what's happening. And kind of the nut and bolt of it is, there's a few schemes, probably about 300 beds, and they kind of let up within just a few months. So pretty quickly, there is clear demand for this type of product out there, as it's good around affordability. There are other, lots of other plus points. We are seeing kind of really strong take up. I think Folk into their scheme down in Earlsfield, got another one kind of more Battersea way that's only just opened, I think. That had over 2,000 kind of inquiries, people wanting to look at it. So you can imagine that also let up pretty quickly. But their Earlsfield scheme let up within a few months.
I think that's an important point to note as well around the inquiries, is that this is the coolest residential product there is. People want to live here, and there's absolutely no questions raised over the demand from residents to live in these kind of this kind of accommodation.
Probably a good point to talk about the kind of price point. What are these typically comparing to versus, say, a one-bed flat in the same sort of area?
Well, so co-living can actually be a more affordable housing offer. It's essentially creating more choice in the market, particularly to renters who often don't have much choice. On the face of it, co-living can seem quite expensive, but they often are kind of all-inclusive rents. So when you look at the wider market on Rightmove per se, a one-bed rent, maybe let's just take a hypothetical rent of £1,400. You're then having to put on all of your extra utility costs and bills. And so kind of I think James kind of models this to say, if you've got kind of a median studio, which isn't always that far off a kind of upper quartile one bed in the wider market, once you've got your bills on top of that, a co-living product is often about 15 to 20% cheaper, a discount to that all-inclusive cost within the wider market.
So it's probably somewhere between sharing a flat and having a room is going to be the lowest cost, then co-living, and then probably
exactly. So you can
bedroom.
get a cheaper cost if you were to say share a house share with 2 or 3 other people. But I think not everybody wants to live in that house share. Some people want their own space. So this kind of gives them the best of both worlds, having their own self-contained space, but then also the ability to socialise with other people around the building.
Yeah, this is the ability to live in a community, in highly amenitized properties generally. So you will have your co-working space, resident lounges, gym, cinema room, a real wealth of amenities within the building.
And how does that amenity provision compare to PBSA and also maybe to the kind of the new build to rent products that are coming forward?
So it's more than both. So what we are seeing is that the amenity provision per unit within co-living is about 4 to 5 square meters a unit per resident, which is a lot more than the student BTR. I don't have the BTR stat, or might, but for student generally it's about 1 to 1.5 square meters per bedroom.
I haven't got the BTR stat.
I think it's not. I mean, the point is it's not mandated.
Yeah. Exactly.
Certainly, the London plan now is being very prescriptive about this 5 square meters of internal amenity, 1 square meter of external amenity, which sets it apart from other products where build to rent does not have any of this amenity standards set out. You can just do purely residential.
Yeah.
So I think that is something interesting, and it will end up setting it apart in the market, I think, for a particular demographic.
I think even build to rent schemes often market themselves as co-living and have that kind of amenity space, but adhere to space standards. I think you mentioned it's the coolest product out there. Other products are kind of referencing the fact that they are that kind of co-living you've got all of the amenities, you've got that social interaction. I think it's the way the world is going.
Yeah, I think if you can get it right, and it feels as though you're living in a very highly spec, well thought out private members club, and that's going to appeal to a very broad demographic.
I think it sort of piggybacks off the kind of the coolness of co-working as well, because they often have a sort of co-working space, and the aesthetic feels a little bit WeWork on some of them. So I think it's sort of trying to place itself in the market.
Completely agree.
Identifiable products where it's like pay as you play, but for living, which I think is quite a kind of interesting.
And I think those co-working spaces are becoming something so much more important since the pandemic.
Yeah.
And if you walk around schemes today, then their co-working spaces are often, pretty busy, and especially on a Monday and a Friday, as people choose to work kind of from home, from their building, and go into work, 2 or 3 days a week. So I think that amenity space is even more important because people are spending more time.
And where do you see this happening? Is it something that is purely urban, zone 1, 2, 3 London? Is it nationally across the UK, a sort of even split in the major cities? What sort of geographical spread?
I think similar to BTR, co-living has kind of started in earnest within London. But again, similar to BTR, the regions are catching up and will probably overtake in a not too distant future. Central urban locations is where it's kind of most obvious that it will work. But we've seen schemes in Guildford and other kind of more kind of smaller locations that also work really well. And even you go back to that first generation scheme collective, Old Oak Common, not a location you'd really think co-living could work. From an investment point of view, it's struggled to sell a couple of times, but from an operational perspective, it's still really successful. So I don't think it's not just urban centres, although obviously they would probably work best.
And so there seems to be a barrier. I mean, we've worked on lots and lots of schemes, co-living schemes, feasibilities that never quite managed to make it. They become residential or hotel, and it seemed like certainly before the pandemic, it was kind of those momentum building behind it. But now it feels like there's quite a lot of people that have got to the point of even having a planning consent, but it can't get delivered. Is there anything other than this sort of second stage review? Is the investor market not yet comfortable with this product? And is that the kind of the barrier to it actually becoming delivered on the scale of, say, student?
We don't think there's any lack of liquidity in the investor market, but the honest truth is it hasn't been properly tested. There just haven't been enough openly marketed exercises of co-living products, whether that's existing products or to fund the schemes to get them out the ground. So the people we talk to want the product. We think it's just more a case that they just haven't had the ability to actually secure representation in this space.
And is that because of the way things are funded? So I think on the other podcast you mentioned there's a few companies doing build to hold, which sort of seems the easiest, although obviously not the way that the student market works, but it seems like the easiest way to kind of establish the market is just build it, operate it yourself, sell the investment after you've stabilized it.
Yeah.
But is that debt market growing to do that particular thing?
Yeah, so what we call, I guess, sort of platform buyers, of which in the student market it's reasonably liquid. Ditto in BTR, people are building up platforms, to get them out the ground, hold them, then sell them. As Paul suggested earlier, we're really at the infancy of the sector. We have a couple of platforms, and obviously of that, probably DTZI, their co-live fund, the scheme that we've been largely referencing, is one of the biggest of those. So they are developing themselves, running operational schemes, but there's not a whole load of those. So I think that we'll expect to see more come through, but clearly it's reliant on funding, which in the current market is a bit more challenging, something that has been previously.
And do you think it's also because there's these buildings, there's so few of them that nobody quite knows what the operational cost of them is? There seems to be two diverging ideas about how co-living is going to be done. So there's the Halcyon folks or even scheme in Wandsworth, which has probably 8 staff on site in the daytime and a couple at night. And it's, it feels like you're very well looked after. And then I think there's another version of co-living where but they've got 200, 300 beds, so they can sort of pay for that. And then you've got another sort of smaller, we're seeing kind of 50, 100 unit schemes coming forward where you've got to pare back that operational cost. So you're going to really, a lot of it's going to be self-serve. And I don't think if anybody knows if that's going to feel too studenty to differentiate itself. 2 questions. One, do you think that's one of the barriers? And second question, which of those do you think is the most likely to succeed?
You're right. I mean, it is a bit of an unknown. actually what it does cost to run these schemes. And at the moment, we're kind of trying to triangulate from both a student, BTR and co-living perspective. We may well get to the point that these schemes are a bit too heavily staffed and it does get pared back a bit. But I think at the moment, everyone's in that sort of discovery stage. My gut feel is that it will come back. So the costs that we do see from third-party manager budgets at the moment do seem on the higher side, especially when you compare it to a student and generally what gets offered on that basis. So my view would be that lighter is the direction of travel, but possibly not as light as some of the people out there who are trying to make it very, very high tech, which applies to everything from virtual staffing through to dispensation, self-service of food and so on.
And I'd like to think, both can work in different places. So there's a difference in price points as well. So you've got your kind of all bells and whistles schemes, and you're prepared to pay a bit of a premium on it. And then you've also got your kind of more affordable options. So there is kind of the scalability within the sector with different price points.
So do you see this maturing over, say, a 30-year period? PBSA is probably 30, 40 years old as a kind of concept, and it has now 700,000 beds approximately across the UK. You're predicting that it's going to grow to a similar level over maybe a similar period of time?
That's the market.
Yeah.
Well, I guess.
First question, do you think it will become as big as student resi?
No, I don't think it's got, it's not going to get as big as PBSA. There is a huge opportunity for it to.
Why is it not going to become as big as student resi?
That's a good question. I've not really thought about it.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, all the factors at the moment are in its favour other than the cost of borrowing. But the cost of borrowing is making the existing sort of landlord model unsustainable.
Yeah.
So it changes to tax. So you're getting a lot of stock ending up back in the hands of owner-occupiers, which is forcing up the price of renters. So, and here you have a solution to the problem. And it kind of works from an investor standpoint, or could be made to. You just feel like everybody should be rushing to deliver this to make up the shortfall that's going to be produced by the current economic situation.
Yeah, and I think that looking at students is probably the wrong comparison to make. I mean, students being, you're right, in the private sector, probably about 40 years, obviously Unite starting down in Bristol, but actually probably for the prior 50 years before that. So when we reference 750, 800,000 unit totality of the market, that includes the university beds as well. So that has been going on a very long time. I think it's more, or it's better to reference the actual BTR market, which is not even 10 years old. And so we think that co-living will ultimately be viewed as a subset of BTR. It's a residential product. It allows much or all of the same flexibility that BTR does, but it will be smaller because ultimately it doesn't have the breadth of the wider market that BTR does, in the sense that it can appeal to families all the way through to single people.
But the entire build to rent sector is going to have to be the thing that does create, does plug this gap. At the moment, I think 50% of people in London, I think it's 20 or 30% of people across the UK live in rented accommodation, which is effectively buy-to-let landlords. 50% in urban areas such as London. If that reduces by even 5%, I think build-to-rent at the moment accounts for about 3% of the UK population. I could be wrong on that, but it's so small and it's going to have to grow very rapidly.
And we've got real kind of supply and demand imbalances within that wider PRS HMO market, and we've seen really strong rental growth over the last couple of years, double-digit rental growth in many kind of regional cities. And there's a couple of things going on there. You've got haven't got mortgage relief for landlords anymore. And you've also got increased regulation coming in terms of environmental kind of goals to net zero in terms of EPCs. So we have seen some landlords exit the sector, particularly those that are highly leveraged, especially as interest rates are now increasing. But because you've got those rental increases, we've also just got lack of churn. So people who are in the rental market are just staying put, because if you're leaving, you're more likely to see your rent increase. So we've got lots of kind of headwinds within that wider rental market, which I think is also, making co-living that little bit more attractive, because you have security of your tenure and also security in your rent, knowing how much you'll be paying month on month.
Yeah, and I think just to go back to your point there, unless planners across the UK turn their back on co-living and looks at some local boroughs, local councils don't like it, but we do expect it to kick on significantly. It will never be as big as BTR, but we do expect this to crystallise itself as a very significant, important part of the residential space.
I think everybody's always looking for that silver bullet in terms of solving the housing crisis, and co-living can be a bit of a Marmite subject, and some people just don't get it and won't ever get it. But I think what co-living does, it just offers greater choice to people within the housing market, particularly the rental market. And so it's not going to be for everybody, but it can be for some people, and then it's providing for them.
Do you think you're going to see a situation where you get speculative co-living developments? Because I have mostly the where we work on them, they're reasonably rare, but the person that's developing it has an idea of exactly who is going to come in and operate the business and where the investment's going to come from. Do you think you're going to see what happens now with Resi, where somebody will get an angle on a site and they'll just get a consent for co-living and just sell it with the consent? Because I haven't yet seen that, and I reckon that might be a marker of it starting to become a legitimate.
We're slowly starting to see developers or land buyers look to flip sites that benefit from a planning permission. So I think that is increasingly coming in, and clearly we're watching the space really closely to see actually who's there to buy it. So yes, it is happening.
And who is there to buy it?
I'd say two separate pools. Definitely those platform companies with big ambitions and to get big in the space. And I think as well there's the more traditional private equity capital who want those 20% returns, 2 times 20% returns. And the only way to really achieve that is to get in at the development stage, i.e. buy the land and then develop it out yourself and run it probably for sort of 1 to 2 years post PC. So I think that those are the two core pots.
And from the development perspective, we've also seen a lot of the PBSA student housing providers enter the sector. People like Scape and others, they know how to operate these types of buildings.
And so they develop it out and then operate it.
Yeah.
And they just add it to their portfolio and they put in the same management team. Yeah, that does make sense. They would be the ones. So if I was, if I'm a developer now, I've got this huge demand coming. Can you give me a couple of things? What one each of what I should be thinking about if I want to move into the co-living sector?
I think you probably have to look at those geographies within the UK where the planning regime is welcoming. I think is sort of probably point number one. And I think that location. So yes, we know that the schemes provide a lot of amenity within themselves, but I think to be able to have that vibrancy on your doorstep as well is tremendously important. Alongside that, so I'm going on a bit here, is the demographic stats. So you need to make sure that demand pool is there. Somewhere regionally like Leeds, for example, you're looking at largely the demand that already exists within the city. London's different because people will travel to London or across London to live in schemes. But I think when you go regionally, you need to look at what demand already exists.
Yeah, and I think look at those kind of key university regional cities, those cities that have a lot of graduates and a lot of graduates who stay. And so places like your Manchesters, your Bristols of this world.
Yeah, students are an important component of the demand pool for this product. So I agree with Paul. Absolutely need to hit off those big university cities. And it's also just important to flag as well in the student accommodation world. When you are delivering a building, it's very important that you do that in a timely fashion ahead of the start of the academic year. We would also strongly recommend the same is done for co-living so that you have the ability to attract a very broad crowd of people.
So final thoughts, guys, a little summary of what you think the future of the market is for this, and the one challenge, one opportunity.
Yeah, so I think that the challenge is the planning regime, specifically in London. The opportunity is, in my view, genuinely vast. And if I was on the client side and had a couple of £100 million, I'd be back in the sector. We've seen that it lets up and it's very attractive to people. You have the ability to set rents annually or more than annually. And in terms of operational real estate, I think it's got a huge amount going for it.
Challenges, I think, planning. Is some planners, some local authorities get it, some don't. And I think there's just a real educational piece that needs to come to inform planners and then, the wider sector, what co-living is, what it looks like, and the benefits of it. And I think the opportunity is just increasing the sector over the next few years, over the next decade, getting more stock into the market and getting people to have a look at this, what it looks like. And I think once they do that, opinions can change and hopefully change quite rapidly, so that planning just becomes hopefully that little bit easier.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming in, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure and great to see you. Cheers.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
If you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe and give us a review, ideally a 5-star one. And if you want to know more, please go to ackroydlowry.com or follow us on Twitter @ackroydlowry and Instagram with the same. This podcast supports Land Aid, the property industry charity that brings together the sector to deliver life-changing projects for young people who really need it. Visit www.landaid.org to find out how you can help end youth homelessness.